thank you all very much for coming along this evening, and we'll be following the usual format, which is that Kat will speak for a certain amount of time. We'll have then a time for questions and comments. Please put your questions via the chat facility, which will help us to kind of sift the questions and group and theme them. Thank you particularly to Kat for agreeing to give the talk this evening. I think Kat is well known to many of us as both a multifaceted and a multi-skilled person in the environmental and social justice sector. But before she began working on Plenty as an administrator, and before she worked for Green Christian in various other ways and for other NGOs, she was for 25 years working in the offshore finance sector. In that time, she had various roles as a policy advisor to a regulator, as a risk director of AXA's offshore online offshore life business, and also as an author and lecturer on various financial and governance issues. So she's going to be talking this evening about offshore finance, its impact on things like tax justice. And thank you, Kat, very much for coming along this evening and talking to us.
Thank you. Thanks. And it's good to see everybody. Thank you for coming to listen to a talk on the turgid subject of tax, which is not normally much of a crowd puller, I must confess. But actually, in this case, we end on a pretty positive note, which is unusual. So without further ado, what I'm going to do is share my screen, if I may. So I'm going to talk about the ways in which I think some of you might have heard me speak in the past about the ways in which tax injustices can hurt us domestically as well as internationally and favour the rich over the poor on many occasions. Surprise, surprise, no surprise at all. The same happens in international spheres, and with rich companies and countries versus those that are more struggling. So we're going to have a little look at that and how it's come about, but then we're going to see how things might be ameliorating. I hope you'll forgive me if I start with a prayer. I always find it helps me to put aside my anger at injustice, but keep my craving to see justice done. So I hope you'll forgive me if I read this. May God bless us with discomfort at easy answers, half-truths, and superficial relationships, so that we may live deep within our hearts. May God bless us with anger at injustice, oppression, and exploitation of people, so that we may work for an economic justice for all people. And the reason that's important to me is that, as we'll see, an awful lot of the injustice that comes about relies on falsehoods, relies on fiction. So we'll have a little gallop through climate change and which countries are suffering the most, typically exploited nations, the taxation of exploitation, what it means for the people in those countries, and how things might get better. So, who are the worst hit countries? Well, we all know that climate change is coming at a terrible cost, and that's in human tragedies, financial pain for many groups and environmental, including other species, not just us. We need to remember that what we do affects all sorts of species. And there's a group of, well, you'd think 20, but it's a group of currently 48 vulnerable countries who have been calling for a much fairer climate and economic system. Last year, they said this: unabated climate change is projected to cause 3.4 million deaths per annum by the end of the century. And that was based on data presented at COP27. Health-related deaths of over 65s will increase by 1,540%. And in India alone, there'll be 1 million additional heat-related deaths by 2090 if no action to limit warming is taken. And thus far, I think we can probably agree that progress has been pitiably slow. It doesn't just affect those poor countries, but it affects them worse. And in more developed countries, sometimes we adapt using, well, what you could call maladaptions, things like plenty of air conditioning, which actually needs lots of electricity and therefore burns lots of fossil fuel if that's how your electricity is generated, and therefore simply adds to the problem. So the solutions that we have access to that other people might not, sometimes help us in the very short term, but make problems much worse in the long term. And climate change is it's a global problem, but it's not being caused globally. So it's affecting the whole world. We are seeing it here, even in the UK, with wilder weather than normal, more extremes, seasons that I don't know what it's like where you all live, but where I'm living, the seasons are confusing the wildlife and the plants, and they put their little heads, their lovely little heads out of the ground and get them immediately frozen off the following week. So we get longer warm spells than we should, and it's difficult for farmers, it's difficult for wildlife, it's difficult for everyone, but it's nothing as compared to what our brothers and sisters in poorer countries such as Africa and the developing countries of Asia, which people tend to refer to as the global south, although it's not just the south. But those countries have lots in common with one another, particularly that they're getting a kicking from the climate. And of course, total greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, some of the nitrogens, they all count, no matter where they're emitted. And most of them are being emitted by us. Most of them are being emitted in the global north, and the carbon footprint of someone living in the US or UK is many times that of someone living a rural life in Africa. I don't know about you, but here in the Isle of Man, we're really tiny here in the Isle of Man. We've got 85,000 people, and we still have politicians saying there's no point in us doing anything while the rest of the world is still churning out fossil fuel emissions. What about China, as one of our politicians regularly says? But of course, everything counts, and there's no point in it's a very difficult moral argument to persuade someone of if they don't understand it. But for me, at least, it's not good to be killing people a little bit just because you're small, or making their lives a misery just a little bit just because you're small. Everybody should do their bit. I think the UK sometimes relies on, sometimes relies on that argument as well. Certainly here, our government has been dragging its feet on the basis that we're little, but every person in the Isle of Man emits, or the per capita emissions are huge compared to those of someone in a developing country. And of course, we're also a one island consumer boom in many ways. So, excuse me, often the global north exports its emissions to the global south. We don't do as much manufacturing as we used to in the UK, and certainly not much at all in the Isle of Man. but we use many items that are manufactured in developing countries where labour and resources are cheaper. There are signs that that's abating a little bit. I think supply chain issues and global tensions between countries mean that governments are realising that some more localism would be more would give them more resilience. But nevertheless, most of the things that we consume here in the Isle of Man are brought in. So while our in-country emissions look less, we've shifted the greenhouse gas emissions of our consumption elsewhere. But if it's food, it's quite often from the UK. If it's stuff, it's quite often from China and elsewhere. And that can make us look as though we're doing better than we are, and it can enable us to avoid accountability for them. But really, we're just outsourcing our emissions. And that's unhelpful. But islands like the Isle of Man and Jersey and Guernsey and the BVI and Bermuda and Luxembourg and many other tax havens, and indeed the UK itself is a tax haven for many countries from other locations, they add an insult to the injury of our consumption and climate exploitation. So these so-called developed economies make use of the international tax system to carry on making sure that we can have all the stuff that we need without giving the countries where we make those things, or we get them out of the ground, or we farm them, without letting those countries have a reasonable tax take. And I was going to say to my shame, but actually I was doing the best I could with the tools I got. That was my understanding of how the world worked at the time, and I have at least got an understanding of how it works. So I spent some 25 years in the offshore finance sector, helping people pay less tax than they otherwise might, people and companies. So let's just think about what this insult added to injury means. Firstly, just 1% of the world's population emitted as much carbon pollution in 2019 as the 5 billion people who make up the poorest 2/3 of humanity. That's huge. That's absolutely huge. And a report commissioned by Oxfam described the intersection between climate crisis and rising inequality as interlaced, fused together, and driving one another. They see it as twin faces of the same problem. And this double damage is created by the world's biggest and richest companies, which disproportionately, I think I've written disproportionately there, contribute to climate chaos through their outsized emissions. But at the same time, they rob governments in struggling countries of the money they need to address the fallout from this, so they can neither mitigate nor adapt to climate change, because their people and their stuff and their land is being made use of by multinationals, but they're not being allowed to keep a reasonable tax take from that, so they don't have the money to prepare themselves. So this double damage exacerbates climate breakdown because it means we're consuming what's still, and it exacerbates inequality, not just between individuals, but between countries. And the amounts being discussed are not trivial by any means. The amount of tax lost every year to multinational companies and rich people using tax havens is there and thereabouts with the money needed each year to cover the estimated costs of climate-induced loss and damage. Loss and damage is something that's being discussed more and more in the context of climate justice. So it's not just climate action, it's climate justice, a way of changing the way that we live so that everybody will have a fair shot at a thriving life. and it's not always the poorest that suffer. You'd think somebody would do something about it, wouldn't you? So far, not so. Lower income countries have been locked out of the decision making on global tax between countries for decades, for many of them since they became independent from whatever empire they were under the cosh of. So for more than 60 years, a small club of rich countries, and that's the OECD, including some of the world's most harmful tax havens, have decided global tax rules behind closed doors of the rest of the world. So they decide on what basis countries will be allowed to retain a withholding tax, on what basis multinational companies will be allowed to move profits from one place to another, to a lower tax country, for example, or to change the pricing of something so that it minimizes their profits in a high tax country and maximizes their profits in a low or no tax country. They've been making those rules behind closed doors, and they've had lots of criticism for prioritizing their rich countries and failing to support lower income countries in their ability to collect the revenues they need. I don't know if any of you remember the Glasgow COP, was that 26 or 26, wasn't it? And just a few weeks before, there had been a G20 meeting in, I think it was Italy, where they had been talking tax and talking about the it was called the Biden tax at the time. There was a move for a global tax agreement that would help to make things fairer, although actually it didn't make things fairer for most of the poorer countries. And the traveling show that is the speakers for these big countries was down in Italy talking about how difficult it all was to make a fairer tax system. And then they all picked up their tents and came up to Glasgow to the COP and discuss how to help struggling countries have the money they needed to adapt. But all the talk was about grants and loans, not on enabling them to retain taxes. And I'll come on to why that's a bad thing. You can probably imagine already, but I'll come on to why that's not a great thing in a moment or so. So, what does all of this mean? What are the consequences for those people and for us? Things get worse for everyone. There's a lovely saying that we all do better when we all do better. And the same is true when things are going wrong. When there are more people struggling, there are more bad consequences, even for those at the top of the pile. So countries at the moment, this might be a couple of years out of date, 2020, collectively lose something like $480 billion in tax to tax havens every year by shifting their profits from the countries where they've done what they're doing, digging stuff out of the ground, having people working in sweatshops and make things cheaply, all of that stuff. They shift that profit to tax havens and find other ways of avoiding their taxes, and also offshore tax evasion by wealthy individuals. There's a debate between what's avoidance and evasion. One is illegal, one is not, but neither of them are particularly ethical. Sorry, it is last year's figure. It was pushed by the Tax Justice Network, which is a fantastic organisation, head office down in the Channel Islands, ironically, but with people all around the world campaigning for a fairer global tax system. And they also say that countries will lose nearly $5 trillion to tax havens over the next decade if they carry on the way they're doing it now and carry on favouring richer nations. So it's the poorer countries that lose it, and it's multinationals, and let's not forget their shareholders, who benefit, because the money that they don't pay in taxes boosts their profits and gets paid out as dividends to shareholders. So the consequence for those impoverished countries can include greater poverty, famine, sometimes wars over resources, and increasing migration as people move to find better lives. And of course, that's something that's much talked about in the UK at the moment with the Rwanda policy. These poor people, we've given their countries a kicking, and we can't even welcome them here. It's a tough thing to watch. So, what is the solution? How do we break this impasse? Well, grants and loans sometimes can be of help, and so the World Bank and European Bank for Investment and Development and other organisations, supranational organisations, can make grants and loans, but they usually come with strings attached. What the money can be used for, how it has to be spent and repaid, and adding to a country's debts, what the interest rate might be. It's quite paternalistic and quite patronising, really. A fairer tax system, on the other hand, would enable those countries whose resources and labour we're benefiting from to get to keep a reasonable tax take without any strings attached. So then they can make their own decisions as to what they think is the right thing to do. They can do the things they believe are appropriate in their context and their culture with that money, including climate mitigation and adaptation, and declining to have their fossil fuel resources further exploited. So a fairer tax system would give them control over their own futures. That hasn't been happening because of the OECD, the League of Big Nations, if you like, setting the agenda and being hugely subject to corporate lobbying. But there are some signs of hope. So the OECD is made up of a few big rich countries. The United Nations, on the other hand, is peopled by many, many much smaller, often quite poor countries as well. And so it gives a voice, and it aims to give a voice to those who are not so powerful. So tax justice organisations around the world have been lobbying for international tax policy to be moved from the OECD's control to the UN. And last year, the UN adopted a resolution to set up a framework for this. I think these things move slowly, they can be quite turgid, but it is truly excellent news. They're well overdue, of course. And as you'd expect, the OECD and the US and the EU kicked up a proper old fuss about it and resisted very strongly, but things are moving and there is reason to be hopeful. And that is good, because when taxes are paid fairly and when our authorities are doing the right things with those taxes, we can trust that there will be the infrastructure and the resources that we need. From Romans 13, verses 6 and 7, that is also why you pay taxes, because the authorities are working for God when they fulfill their duties. Pay then what you owe them. Pay your personal and property taxes and show respect and honour for them all. And that's why it's too slow coming, but it's really good news. The existence of an international tax system that allows multinationals to avoid paying fair taxes in the countries they exploit is just heaping pain on pain. It stops them deploying the money as they believe is fit, and that is changing, and that is spectacularly good news. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Many years ago, no, about 8 or 9 years ago, I actually wrote an article for the Tax Justice Network on what it was like coming from the background that I've just talked about, helping multinational companies to avoid paying the taxes they otherwise might. And it was quite a seismic moment for me, because I realized that most of what I did, and all the bright-eyed boys and girls who work in the offshore finance sector, sometimes it's described as a product or a scheme, but setting up ways for people to avoid paying their taxes, they almost always rely on a fiction, a lie. So I would be asked by my boss to find a way to, let's find a way that this Saudi family doesn't have to leave all their money to by forced airship or whatever it might be, or won't find that they're being subjected to inheritance tax. And you want to please your boss, so you think you're doing a good job. But when you unpick it all, what people like me and other product developers in the offshore tax arena were doing was saying, okay, so if they put their money in this and it pays out a dividend, they'll get taxed on it. Don't want that. So let's call it something else. Let's call it a guarantee for a loan. And we'll actually make it true, because we'll put the paperwork in place so it's legal. Really, what you're doing is scaffolding a fiction. You're setting up something that has no commercial reality behind it, so that the taxman's gaze can't penetrate this bubble you've created around it. And it's legal. But when I realized that it was based on mythic structures, I realized that it was deeply unethical. And I think there are probably quite a few people in the offshore arena that maybe are coming to that realization. Sometimes I think it's time for a bit of outreach to some of them. But anyway, so there is, however, real cause for happiness in that the UN is looking set fair to improve the lot of poorer countries. And although it will take time and squabbling, I'm quite sure, it does set the scene for something better. That is my talk.
Thank you.
And I'd love to hear any questions you might have.
So people can either put questions in the chat or just raise a hand. Perhaps I can just start, Kat, and I don't know to what extent you know the answer to this, but when you know, what were the circumstances in which offshore finance and the kind of mechanisms they offer suddenly became, or over time became valued? You know, how did it start? Is this a pre-Second World War thing? Is it dated to a period in the 50s or 60s? Do you have any views on, you know, what were the triggers that sort of led to this?
Yes, it's a really good question. So I don't know for all countries. I don't know which was the first tax haven, for example. In the Isle of Man, it was the 60s-ish, 50s and 60s. And it was caused because, as a nation, the island was running out of ways to make its living, and it was running out of people, because people were migrating to get a better life in, for example, the UK or Ireland, where there was work. It was, they call it spuds and herrings, so it was farming and fishing, and it was a pretty tough life. And then a bright spark in the Treasury realised that because we were technically not a part of the UK, we could write our own laws, and did, and still do, although they do have to be approved by the Crown. And so we could set our own tax levels, and we could treat people who didn't live here differently from people who did. So residents might have a slightly lower rate of tax and no capital gains tax, but non-residents would pay none at all. And I'm going to diverge and tell a funny story, if I may. There was a, but it is relevant. There was a chap called Cook. Was it Roger Cook, who used to run an investigative program, and he used to go around doorstepping people with their microphone, mostly baddies, calling them out on whatever they were doing. And he came over to the Isle of Man in the 80s or 90s. I think I was working by then. And he knocked on the door of a now deceased, but at the time prolific company formation agent called Patrick Diamond. Knocked on the door with a microphone, and then, because nobody would answer, he said into the microphone to the TV, "Did you know that you can form a company for £200 here, and you can use it to do anything and make any profits anywhere in the world, and nobody will pay any tax, and nobody will know it's you." And Patrick was in the pub at the end of the day, and we were all patting him on the back. Sorry, the following day when the programme had aired, saying, "That sounds like it was really tough, Patrick." He said, "It was wonderful. The phone's been ringing off the hook all day long." So it was good publicity. But yeah, so I'd say around the 60s for the offshore British dependencies. I'm not sure about others.
Mark, you've just referred to a book by Laurie Parsons called Carbon Colonialism. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what you found interesting about it?
I embarrassed myself by sending a reference to it to Jeremy Williams to find that he'd already reviewed it 6 months ago. I missed it on his website. But it's a fantastic book, mainly about Cambodia, but really emphasizing how the resources are extracted out of the global south to fuel the economies of the global north. Basically, we are rich because they are poor. That's the message, and it's all about the sweatshops and the brick ovens and the fact that these multinationals have gone in with the strings attached that Kat mentioned there and managed to do that that extraction. And it's really, I mean, it's so positive to hear that what Kat had to say about the United Nations. The only thing that strikes me is that that's a bit like the rest of climate change. It's going to happen glacially slowly when we need sort of rapid change. I think about the OECD as $1 one vote, and the United Nations is slightly better. It's one government, one vote. To get faster change, Kat will not be surprised to hear me saying this, that I'm looking for proper global governance where it really is one person, one vote. So that I sometimes do this thought experiment based on the UK, but it could apply everywhere. If all the money in the tax havens or whatever bank accounts you have is all contained mostly by the top 10% of the wealth population, they've got all the income and the wealth, and the other 90% are, as Mrs. May said, struggling to get by, or just managing. I think there must be something definitely wrong with all our systems if the top 10%, in my terms, or in Pat's terms, the top 1% who really are the elite, who have set up all these structures to benefit themselves and their multinational organizations. If they have managed to do that and have got, how come in even a democratic system, 1% or 10% of the population can overrule and sort of basically run the system for their benefit when 9 out of 10 people would be greatly enhanced by a fairer say. So that's why I think to get fast momentum, we probably need something even better than the structures, or the structures of the United Nations need to be changed to allow people, big population of this global south, to have their voice really heard, to try and bring proper tax justice and undo all these other injustices that we have just been presented by Kat.
Yeah. It's really interesting you say that. I was at an interfaith meeting recently, and there was a gentleman there who's a member of the Baha'i faith, and they are very set on the idea of a single global government, which would do things on a more just basis. I haven't gone into it in any depth with him, but it was interesting to hear his theories on how that would bring about peace, justice, and economic fairness.
And Judith in the chat has a comment about the irony, if you like, that companies like Amazon and Starbucks are, consistently using the sort of the international tax system to avoid paying taxes. But indeed this even harms the UK at times. But nevertheless, we're all, or many of us, people in churches, as Judith says, continue to patronize these companies. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Yes, I do actually. And you're quite right, Judith. It's not just how they shift their profits around internationally. It's damaging every single taxpayer in the UK, because many of the people who work in Amazon warehouses, etc., for example, are on universal credit, and their rates of pay are as low as they are because we, the taxpayer, are making up the rest of their cost of living through the universal credit that they have to claim because their pay is so low. So Amazon is profiting by pulling money through the benefits system. Yeah, we're subsidizing their profits, and that happens with quite a few of the more major companies, especially those that use people on 0 hours contracts and the like. So it's possible it should be possible to show that. So you're quite right. The CEO is benefiting, and in fact, the rate of the multiplier between the lowest paid and the highest paid in these companies has grown hugely. I think about 50 years ago, it was something like 35 times, and now it's a couple of hundred times more that the richest, the highest earner earns as a multiple of the least, or even the median earner. So that's one aspect of where it's going. And the other is, of course, that it's going into shareholders' pockets. Now, sometimes even us ordinary people are the beneficiaries of that, because many shares in these companies are held by pension funds, whether it's private pensions or the state pension. So there might be an argument to say, well, you might get a bit of it back eventually. But of course, an awful lot of shares are also held by the already wealthy, and in structures where they're not going to pay tax on that either. So I would love to see a piece of research that shows how this Victorian construct of a company, which was originally created to enable people to take risks, to go into business without losing their house and so forth, so it was to limit risk, is now being used to put all of the risk onto, or much of the risk onto, the environment and the workers, and shielding the shareholders and the top earners. So, but that balance has changed. So it used to be pretty much a fair reward for a certain amount of risk, but now those risks are externalized. The poor girl in the sweatshop who's going to have rubbish health is taking some of that risk. The country that can't afford to mitigate climate change is shouldering that risk, and the rewards to the owners of capital have increased incredibly. I'd love to see it put in a visual form, because these things can be quite dry, and communicating tax justice is really tricky. It tends to send people to sleep. Excuse me, I can see most of your eyes are still open, but hey ho. But I think there's a really interesting graphic to show how companies, which are really intended to enable entrepreneurialism by limiting risk, have become a vehicle for stopping trickle-down economics and creating a flood upwards into the pockets of the rich. Am I ranting?
No,
All right
no,
to say yes.
not at all. There's a question from Barbara, but before that, perhaps I could put another question. In your experience, Kat, what has been the your impressions of the British government's attitude to tax havens? I mean, you described the the kind of the big idea with the Isle of Man, a sort of place in the 60s that was losing people and struggling to make ends meet, and offshore finance seemed a great idea. But over your years in the industry, do you have any general impressions of the British government's approach to this and the extent to which they sort of support or kind of just allow what's going on?
I do, yeah. They absolutely support it. So most London-based asset managers will have an offshore arm somewhere so that they can run portfolios in the language they use is always so benign, tax efficient, tax friendly environment, so they can multiply up the profits that they're making for their clients, assuming they're making profits. The relationship between the regulators in the offshore islands and wherever they're a dependency of is usually very friendly, as long as so major countries need tax havens, or at least the residents of major countries and the multinationals need and want tax havens. If it transpires that there is money laundering going on, then things get very different, but they are very accommodating about certain kinds of tax structures. So when I was first working in offshore finance, there were many more structures available. The world doesn't seem willing to let offshore islands do lots of those things anymore. But the offshore insurance industry is still massive, and it's a massive earner for the Isle of Man. And again, it's one of these things that's based on a fiction. So it's really an investment product with a very minimal, usually 1% insured element to it, but it enables people to avoid inheritance taxes and roll up their profits on a much greater basis. Last year or the year before, was it when Ukraine and Russia? It was the year before. Ukraine and Russia was all kicking off. I did some work for Margaret Hodge, who was taking through the economic crime bill, both the first and the second chunk of that. And that was because all of a sudden everybody got very excited about the fact that huge swathes of UK property are owned by Russian oligarchs through offshore companies. And that's been the case forever, and people haven't been paying taxes on them. It took a war. It took a war for them to do what they'd been promising to do for 5 or 6 years. I think the bill had been on the back burner, and there are still huge chunks of it that are not particularly effective. They don't have a way to. They don't have so the offshore islands now have kind of got with the program. So we're misused because we've gone from people rocking up with an Adidas bag full of used tenors, which used to happen. Banks would buy in note counting machines, to introducing laws that enable the same sort of thing to happen in compliance with the law. So we can say, yeah, we've got anti-money laundering laws and we enforce them, and etc., but we've got all sorts of carve-outs and structures and schemes and all the rest of it. And we're allowed to do that because the League of Big Nations needs it to keep the profits high, and because corporate lobbyists have the ear of government. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded. Did that make sense? Did it answer your question?
Yes, yeah, I think it did, Kat. Jonathan has a question. The City of London is well known for facilitating offshore investments and attracting dirty money, but is there anything that can be done, or are those involved just too powerful?
It's political will, isn't it? It's about political will, and when 85% of the Commons and the Lords are millionaires, I'm not confident. I should be more confident. I would love to see people running for election and getting elected. Sorry, I'm sounding more politicky than I should. I'm a lefty, and I mean a proper lefty, not a Starmer lefty. That's my personal view. And until we get people in power who care about ordinary people and their interests, and even understand what life is like for them, nothing will change. Nothing will change. But we do have powerful voices in the Lords through the bishops and through people like Baron Prem-Seeker, who is a total social justice warrior. Lots of things that seem to get through the Commons that, in my personal not very humble opinion, shouldn't get kicked into touch in the Lords. You get some remarkably sane and godly views being expressed. In America, they have a charity called Run for Something, and it gets ordinary kids. It's a progressive organization, so I suppose you could say it's a bit lefty, but it can see that the rich have the political system sewn up. They can arrange that voting schedules are timed so that working people on certain shifts can't go. They can put voting stations in places that poor people can't afford to get to. I'm sounding like a right old conspiracy theorist. Anyway, what they do is encourage young people to do something like run for the school board or run for the local council. Get used to having views, articulating views, get used to being rejected, because that's a part and parcel of being in politics, and get used to working their way up through the system so that maybe in half a generation's time, this will pay off with people who care about ordinary people being in power. And I would love to see that happen over here. I keep thinking I might start one myself, but I don't think I've got the knowledge.
There's a number of points coming in. Barbara asks, is there any way safe tax havens like the Isle of Man could be forced to stop offering the no taxes paid, just give us £200 to set up company set up? Could that be stopped?
Could it be stopped? It's a very good question. You could stop it at the level of, well, protectorates can usually be legislated for, but that's not going to happen out of Westminster while there are too many people with their money tucked away over here. A lot of the royal families, wider royal family, have their money on the island. Could they be stopped? They could be stopped if the global political will was to rule out the kinds of laws that are enabling it at the moment. It's not going to come from the Isle of Man because sadly, our government has no other plan. And Jersey and Guernsey have been through, or Jersey certainly has been through something similar a while back. So we, I always say the Isle of Man went from piracy to smuggling to money laundering to tax evasion, and now, heaven forfend, our biggest industry is offshore gambling companies, gaming companies. So there really doesn't seem to be a plan for how to earn our living in a way that's not embarrassing. It's a great shame because it's a gem of an island and with some gems of people. They have no other plan. And at the moment, the Isle of Man government itself is burning through its general reserves at the rate of 20% a year. We will be broke within 4 years. Now, with UK councils going broke left, right and centre, it's going to be interesting to see how services can be provided that would normally fall to a local council. In the Isle of Man, there is no fallback. We don't print our own money. We're not a sovereign nation. So they are really loath to let go of any industry that is keeping people's bums on seats in jobs. Most of what we get out of being a tax haven, because obviously we're not taking the tax either, is through income taxes of people working in those industries. And now they've gone from working in company and trust organisations, because that has fallen significantly with changes in international law, to still offshore life products and offshore gaming companies. And they always claim that they're not here for the tax benefits, but I'm sure they're not here just because we're so good at bookkeeping. So I don't hold out much hope, John. I'm sounding a bit negative.
Thanks, Kat. There are a couple of other questions coming in. You may just want to bat this back and not really want to respond, but John Fowler asks, and let's paraphrase it slightly. Have you ever been tempted to, or actually been a whistleblower in this context? And did you ever? And what was the consequence if you did? You may not want to answer that, and I don't feel you have to.
I've given evidence against an employer, but it wasn't a tax issue. It was to do with, it was back when South Africa had exchange controls, and so not specifically in a tax consequence. I have a friend though who has done so, interestingly, against Doug Barrowman's company. This is going back quite a few years though. There were some taxation skullduggery going on back then, and he was fired and went to a tribunal and got a massive payout that probably meant he didn't need to work again, but he does. But he was incredibly brave, because it's really difficult going through it. It took a couple of years for everything to work through, and he was a young man with a young baby, and I really admired his courage in sticking to his guns and going to the tribunal and bringing out onto the table all of the issues that he was concerned about. I guess the Barrowman and Moan case is a really good example of how intertwined Westminster and the offshore islands can be sometimes.
Do you just want to expand that, Barrowman and Moan?
Yeah. So some of you might have been aware that there is a peer called Baroness Moan, Michelle Moan, who set up an underwear company. So she was a businesswoman and did really well. Hats off to her. Scottish woman, and she married a chap called Doug Barrowman, who has a number of businesses in the island that run tax efficiency schemes. They were caught up in actually, they're very caught up in the loan recharge scandal, which is a case where HMRC, so lots of individuals, primarily in the nursing sector, healthcare sector, were told by their employers that they could only work for the healthcare company they were working for if they were employed by an Isle of Man company, and they would be paid tax efficiently by the repayment of a loan that they'd never made. And so repayment of a loan, sorry, I'm kind of oversimplifying it there. And the scheme didn't work anyway. So they were missold a scheme. They weren't accountants or tax experts. There are tens of thousands of them. There have been at least 10 suicides because HMRC is now going after the individuals for, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of pounds of income tax. And several of those schemes were run out of the Barrowman offices. I think it might have been Knox Darcy, but he's got a couple of businesses. The issue with Baroness Moan was that she she used the VIP lane for sourcing PPE in the COVID crisis. She recommended a particular company to do the business, and it got a multi-million pound contract, and it made multi-million pounds of profit, 60 million, I think. And the profits all went into an Isle of Man company, and she denied having anything to do with it or benefiting from it. And that was not the case. And in fact, some 28 million has gone into a trust for her and her kids directly from that. So there was I actually felt very sorry for her in a way. There was a horrible car crash interview on the BBC with Laura Kunsberg. It was revealing that the things that she said, because she said, well, of course I didn't want people to know about it. You know, I want to protect my privacy and my children. And that's how people, I think many people view, private individuals anyway, view using offshore. It's private, it's nobody else's business. But she was rather hauled over the coals because she lied to the press about it for about a year. And then I think her rebuttal to Laura Kunsberg was, it's not a crime to lie to the press. But of course, you're lying to the country. And it's not a terribly high moral bar to hold yourself to, is it? So, yeah, that's the background there. And it's put the Isle of Man in another bad light. It used to be whenever I said I'm from the Isle of Man, they said, oh, that's where, who was the comedian? Kenny, chap with buck teeth and a tickling stick.
Ken Dodd.
Ken Dodd.
Yes, Ken Dodd.
Yeah. So he was squirreling cash away in those days, and that made the Isle of Man look very bad. And this is our latest Ken Dodd.
Goodness. Thank you, Kat. Are there any other questions? Maybe just a hands up. Any other questions that you want to put to Kat? Terry, yeah, if you can unmute.
Yeah, listening to you, Kat, is so helpful. But I'm just quite twisted up and angry about taxation, because my view is that taxation was to take money from people who are earning well or companies for the benefit of society.
Yeah.
And that seems to have gone completely out of the window.
Yeah. I 100% agree. And you take me back to the theology of taxation, Terry, because throughout the Bible, we're told that we should pay our taxes with respect to those who are taking them from us. We should pay them willingly. If you're lucky enough to be paying tax, it probably means you're at least earning some money.
Yeah.
And it's how we love our neighbour, mediated by HMRC. Yeah, I I share your anger. I think there are probably a lot of people in the industry who, and I was one of them, so I can't judge, who think they're doing a good thing because their jacket's on the back of the chair for 10 hours a day. You know, they work long days. Their boss is proud of them. Their clients are grateful to them. And what's not to like? But I will say that certainly in legal circles as well as in tax justice circles, the mood is changing. It's no longer cool to say, "Oh, in the golf club, or you know, I don't pay any tax on that. I've got it tucked away in the Isle of Man." That is not a cool thing to do. It is. It makes you look mean-spirited and spiteful and ungenerous. I'm looking forward to the day when it's very cool to say, "I pay lots of tax."
And indeed, we again heard headlines or saw headlines from Davos saying the super rich want to be taxed more.
Do you remember when? Yes. Oh, my patriotic millionaires. They're absolutely terrific people. There's an organization, you can look them up. They're originated in the States, called Patriotic Millionaires, and they have some brilliant speakers. A lovely chap called Gary. You can find him on Twitter if you Twitter. He has he goes under at Gary's Economics, and he is a boy who is a young man who's made his way from absolute poverty as a trader to becoming a multimillionaire, and he campaigns for wealth taxes, which is what my job at Church Action for Tax Justice used to be, campaigning for wealth taxes, which is how we got in touch. And of course, the very wealthy can. There is a system where you can voluntarily pay more tax if you want to. I don't think it's heavily used, but the point is they want it to be across the board. That's how you get the several billion that we need to get our infrastructure and services being properly looked after.
Okay, so we're over the hour now. Any final questions before we say goodbye to Kat? Oh, Judith.
Yeah. What can we do as individuals apart from donate to Tax Justice or Church Action for tax?
Yeah, that's
we
a really
can. I mean,
good
that's
question.
the best thing. I mean, if that's fine, then tell us all. Because I don't know how many people here are probably feeling guilty, because if most of us are getting older, living off pensions or savings, and it's only when you get older, I'm lucky enough to have enough savings.
It's a really good question, Judith. And I think donating to those kinds of organisations. So my job at Catch, Church Action for Tax Justice, dried up when the money dried up. There was no more funding for it, which was slightly ironic because our previous funder had been Scottish Provident, who have a substantial offshore life business. But hey ho. So donating to those kinds of organisations and think tanks and signing their petitions and all that is really good. I really believe, though, that the church, in its many manifestations, should be using its voice to that effect. So we can, as individuals, we can donate, we can write to our MPs or MHKs, we can run campaigns, but the church as a whole should also be engaging with these issues. It shouldn't shy away from things that are painful and uncomfortable. There is a day in the year, and I will find the date and email it so it can be sent out to you all, where it's called Tax Justice Sunday. And ECCR, who are now called the Just Money Movement, would provide resources to run a service based around the ideas of tax justice. They have even got hymns with the words changed that speak to exactly that. There's one about Zacharias climbing up a tree. But they have some really powerful prayers and extracts of liturgy. And And talking about it in church to congregations matters because it raises awareness. But we also need to be encouraging our bishops and our faith leaders to speak to those in power and say, this is what we want. We want a fairer system. We don't mind paying our taxes as long as everybody pays their fair taxes.
Kat, thank you so much for not only an insightful talk, but a very inspiring one. And thank you for all your thoughts and suggestions, your responses, and thanks also to you, the audience, for some really good questions. So, Kat, we've really enjoyed our time with you this evening.
Thanks for indulging me. I really appreciate it.
No, it's not an indulgence; it's a necessity. It's
the other thing we can do, of course, and I should have said this first, is pray.
Yeah.
That the hearts of those in power could be changed.
Yeah. On that note, thank you and good night, everyone. Thank you.